In the autumn of 1066, a town on the edge of the Baltic Sea burned down and nobody ever came back to rebuild it. Thousands of people had lived inside its walls. By morning, the survivors had scattered across the water, and the ashes just sat there, untouched, for the next 1,000 years. No king rebuilt it. No merchant reopened its docks. It simply vanished from the map. And that single, quiet ending marks something much bigger than the death of one town. It marks the death of the entire Viking Age. Because for almost 250 years, the Vikings had pulled off something no other people in Europe had managed. They raided every coastline from Ireland to the Black Sea. They colonized Iceland, Greenland, and touched the edge of North America centuries before Columbus. They served as the personal bodyguards of the Byzantine emperor in Constantinople. They founded the first princedoms of Russia. They became kings of England, dukes of Normandy, and rulers of Sicily. They built the single largest trade network anywhere in the medieval world. And almost all of it ran through one town, a cramped, muddy five-language trading post where silver coins minted in Baghdad were exchanged for Arctic furs, British captives, and Baltic amber. That town paid for the longships. It paid for the raids. It paid for the settlements. And when it burned, the whole machine that had powered the Viking world for 2.5 centuries burned with it. So, actually killed it. Why did a network that had outlasted kings, popes, and entire empires suddenly collapse in a single generation? And how does one small trading town on a foggy inlet end up marking the death of an entire age of history? Stick with me because the real answer isn't a single battle or a single king. It's a slow chain reaction that took decades to detonate, and once you see how all the pieces fit together, you'll never think about the Vikings the same way again. That town was called Hedeby, and calling it a city is generous. It was really a marketplace surrounded by houses, tucked inside a defensive earthwork on a narrow inlet called the Schlei. But inside that modest rampart lived more than 1,000 people, maybe several thousand at its peak, speaking 5 different languages on the same muddy street: Old Norse, Frisian, Slavic, Frankish, and Arabic. Traders haggled over prices at the water's edge. Blacksmiths hammered imported Swedish iron into tools and weapons. Captives taken from raids across the British Isles were marched off ships and sold on the spot. Silver coins were sliced in half with a blade to make exact change, because in this economy, weight mattered more than the face stamped on the metal. This unassuming little port was, without exaggeration, the busiest and richest trading hub in the entire Viking world. And here's the part that surprises most people. The Vikings weren't primarily warriors. They were merchants first. Raiding got the dramatic write-ups in monastic chronicles because burning monasteries makes for a better story than balancing a ledger, but trade is what actually built the empire. A captive bought cheaply in Ireland could be resold for many times the price in Spain or Baghdad. Silver coins purchased from Arab merchants along the Volga River were worth a fortune once carried back to silver-starved Norway. Walrus ivory hunted in the Arctic Circle could be sold to Frankish bishops who paid in solid gold for a single tusk. Amber picked up for almost nothing on Baltic beaches became a luxury item the moment it reached Frankish nobility. The Vikings were running one of the longest and most profitable trade chains in the medieval world, stretching from the Arctic Circle all the way to the gates of Baghdad, and they kept that machine running for 2.5 centuries. When the first Viking longships hit the coast of Lindisfarne in 793, they carried warriors, sure. But for every warrior who set sail over the following 2 centuries, there was very likely a trader right beside him, sometimes several. These weren't just raiding parties. Entire families sailed together, with merchant scales, account sticks carved with tally marks, and coins stamped with Arabic script tucked into their cargo. It was a mobile economy unlike anything else in Europe at the time, and the secret weapon behind it was their ships. A single Viking vessel could handle open ocean swells, shallow rivers, and frozen fjords, all without needing a different hull design for each. Combine that with trading posts spread across thousands of miles of coastline, and you get a network that moved faster than any king, tax collector, or bishop in continental Europe could ever hope to track down. For roughly 250 years, absolutely nobody could match that speed or reach. And then, starting in the 11th century, the walls of the outside world slowly began closing in around them. Here's the twist most people never see coming. The Vikings didn't get conquered from the outside. They basically dissolved from the inside by quietly turning into someone else. And the very first crack in the foundation wasn't a battle. It was a building. In the year 826, a Frankish monk named Ansgar sailed into Hedeby carrying a wooden cross, a satchel of scripture, and permission from a curious Danish king who wanted to understand the religion of his southern trading partners. Ansgar built a small wooden church right inside the town's rampart, the very first Christian church ever raised in Scandinavia. And for roughly the next 100 years, that little church just sat there, quietly, right alongside altars dedicated to Thor. Norse traders wore a hammer pendant and a small cross on the exact same leather cord around their neck, hedging their spiritual bets the same way they hedged their trade deals. Christian missionaries went from being foreign curiosities to tolerated background noise to simply part of the scenery. Pagan graves and Christian graves started turning up side by side in the very same burial grounds. Slowly, almost invisibly, over the span of a full century, Christianity stopped being an outsider's religion and started becoming just another thread woven into everyday Norse life. Then, in 965, everything tipped. The King of Denmark, Harald Bluetooth, converted to Christianity, and to mark the occasion, he raised a massive stone monument. On one face, an image of Christ, arms outstretched, wrapped in traditional Norse knotwork patterns. On the other face, an inscription declaring that he had won all of Denmark and Norway for himself, and made the Danes Christian. From that exact moment forward, paganism in Denmark was living on borrowed time. Bishops arrived. Wooden stave churches went up across the countryside. Old sacred groves got quietly repurposed. Ancient festivals were folded into the new Christian calendar until nobody could really tell where the old traditions ended and the new ones began. 300 years of Norse belief started winding down, not because of a single decree, but because of one king who had chosen a side, and that same stone he raised is still standing in a field in Denmark today, over 1,000 years later. Once that religious shift took hold, 3 separate pillars of the Viking economy cracked almost simultaneously, and this is where things start moving fast. The first pillar to crack was the slave trade. As a matter of principle, Christians generally didn't enslave fellow Christians. As Ireland, England, and the rest of the British Isles converted to Christianity, the supply of people who could legally be captured and sold started drying up. At the same time, markets further east grew increasingly hostile toward Christian middlemen trafficking captives, so demand shrank too. The single most profitable commodity in the entire Viking trading network, the very same one that got bought cheap in Ireland and sold high in Baghdad, became harder and harder to move with every passing decade. The second pillar to crack was taxation. Christian kings did something pagan chieftains had almost never bothered doing before. They built organized tax systems. A merchant who used to slip past Frankish tax collectors with ease now found a royal official waiting for him back at his own home harbor, ledger in hand, demanding both a church tithe and a duty to the crown. And the third pillar to crack was the calendar itself. A Christianized Hedeby couldn't trade on Sundays anymore, or fast days, or days, or the long stretches of Lent and Advent. A market that once operated 365 days a year suddenly ran on something closer to 200. The same merchant fleet that had once outrun every European tax collector on the continent had slowed down to the rhythm of its own church bells. One commodity at a time, one harbor at a time, one holy season at a time, the Vikings were being quite absorbed into the very system they had spent 2 centuries dodging. And then, Nut. In 1016, he conquered England outright. In 1018, he inherited the throne of Denmark. By 1028, he had taken Norway too, stitching together a Christian Danish empire that stretched across the entire North Sea. He was crowned inside cathedrals. He sent official ambassadors all the way to Rome. In 1027, he personally traveled to attend the coronation of the Holy Roman Emperor and met the Pope face to face, becoming the very first Viking ruler formally recognized by Rome as a legitimate Christian king. Think about that for a second. The same Norse world that once terrorized Christian monasteries was now ruled by a king who was busy funding monasteries of his own. The same trade routes that once ran on hacked silver fragments and Arab dirhams now ran on minted Christian coinage. A Viking merchant trading in the year 1030 was paying his church tithe, observing his fasting days, and would eventually be buried under a cross. Same bloodline, same town, but a completely different world. By the year 1040, the entire system that once powered Hedeby had almost entirely dissolved from within. The town was still physically standing, the harbor still busy, ships still and went. But the pagan merchants who had built the place were gone, replaced by Christian kings who had their eyes locked on England, not on the trade routes along the Volga. And while those kings were distracted looking south and west, the eastern markets they'd stopped paying attention to had already started slipping away. If religion was the first crack, money was the second, and this one hit even harder. For 2 centuries, the entire engine running Hedeby was fueled by silver, and not just any silver. Specifically, silver mined deep in Central Asia, carried thousands of miles up the Volga River, and hoarded in buried pits scattered across Scandinavia. But by the year 1000, that silver supply started drying up completely. The Samanid dynasty in Central Asia, which had produced the vast majority of it, was collapsing under its own weight. Their mines were running dry. Their political grip was crumbling. By the early 11th century, the dynasty was simply gone, and the Eastern Silver Pipeline that had bankrolled the entire Viking economy shut off almost overnight. And as if that wasn't brutal enough, geography turned against Hedeby too. The town sat on the shallow Schlei Inlet, and that shallowness had always been its greatest protection, since a shallow draft longship could slip in and out with ease while heavier enemy ships couldn't follow. But shallow water carries a hidden cost. It silts up over time. By the middle of the 11th century, the channel leading into Hedeby was choking with sand. Ships were running aground. Cargo had to be unloaded further and further from the actual docks. The very harbor that had built the town's fortune was now slowly strangling it. And just to make things worse, a completely different kind of ship was being built just south of Hedeby around this exact time, the cog. Deeper hull, higher sides, a single mast. A flat bottom that could be loaded while sitting in shallow water, but with cargo capacity that dwarfed anything Norse shipbuilders had ever produced. A traditional longship might carry around 10 tons of cargo. An early cog could carry 50. A larger one, upward of 100. The longship had been engineered for speed and stealth, perfect for raiding and slipping away unnoticed. The cog was engineered for one purpose only, hauling as much cargo as physically possible, as cheaply as possible. The merchant economy of Northern Europe no longer needed stealth. It needed volume, and that volume sailed under a completely different flag. And the replacement for Hedeby didn't come from some distant land. It sprang up just 5 kilometers north on the opposite bank of the exact same inlet, a new town called Schleswig, sitting on a deeper harbor with much better access for these new, larger ships. By the 1070s, Schleswig was being actively developed, plot by plot, with organized streets and a growing population of German merchants moving in. Same inlet, same trade routes, completely town. And while Schleswig rose, Hedeby, just 5 kilometers south, kept slowly